Everyone. Welcome to the Weitzman School, a celebration of design. I'm Fritz Steiner, and I have the honor of serving as Dean of the Weitzman School. And one of my responsibilities is to start things on time and try to keep things on time. So it's 1 o'clock, so we're starting on time. Today we are celebrating the school's new name, the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and paying tribute to the incredible vision and generosity of Stuart Weitzman. Stuart is here today with his wife Jane, their 2 daughters Rachel and Elizabeth Elizabeth's husband Eric, and their daughter Ava. It was 150 years ago this fall when the first architectural drawing class was offered here at Penn, planting the seed for today's School of Design. Thanks to Stuart's belief in the singular power of design to enhance our lives and his commitment to advancing the work of our incredible faculty and students, we are poised to make the next 150 years even more memorable than the first. So again, thank you, Stuart, for your belief in Penn and your belief in Penn design. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of our first panel discussion. Along with an unparalleled history and innovation, one thing that makes Philadelphia great is a community of writers and journalists who are committed to making the city a better place to live for everyone. Few have become more outspoken champions of design excellence than Inga Saffin. Yeah. Whose work as a critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer over the last 20 years has earned her a Pulitzer Prize and a number of other prestigious awards. Please join me in welcoming Inga.
Well, thank you very much, Fritz. That was very nice. And we have a great panel. And I'm going to give a little short biography of each person. And then they're going to make very short presentations. And then we'll get to talk about design. So first, on my left is James Corner, who is the founder and director of James Corner Field Operations. And the firm is probably best known for their design of the High Line. I hardly even need to tell you that, I'm sure. He is also the professor emeritus of landscape architecture at the Weitzman School. And he served as the department chair from 2000 to 2012. He was among the first practitioners to incorporate industrial relics into landscape design, and he has worked on projects around the world, including in Philadelphia, where he designed our own Race Street Pier. We have Doreen Lorenzo, who is the assistant dean of the School of Design and Creative Technologies at the University of Texas. And as a former president of Frog, that's a company, a product design firm, she looked at ways that design of both physical and web products can evoke emotion and empathy. And she's emphasized the need to put the user experience first. She's been a columnist for Fast Company, for Co-Design, and for Medium. We have Marion Weiss, who co-founded Weiss Manfredi. She is the Graham Chair, Professor of Architecture at the Weitzman School. It doesn't seem right to call her an architect because so much of her work fuses architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. And this is especially visible in the ramped outdoor spaces of the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. But you may also see this fusion in many of the firm's buildings, including the Singh Center for Nanotechnology at Penn, which is right around the corner. So we're going to start with James, who's going to do his presentation.
Thank you, Inga. It's a great pleasure to be here. Firstly, a big thank you to Stuart Weitzman. I wish you'd written this gift when I was chair here. It would have made a huge difference. And I can see already the impact that your gift has had, so thank you very much. We have 2 minutes to just say some introductory remarks. And the topic for this panel, I understand, is called the balancing act, or design as a balancing act. And in that sense, what is design and where does design have value? And you could generally say that design falls into 3 buckets. One is the problem-solving aspect, taking on the issues, understanding what the issues of any particular project are, and trying to figure out solutions, problem solving. The second might be what we'll call design, the formal issues of trying to work through an issue in terms of the form, the material, the look, the image, the object. And the third would be the conceptual. What is the concept behind the work? What makes it cultural? You could say that an engineering mindset solves problems. An artistic mindset works with form and with concept. But a design mindset has to balance all 3. Design at its best works with all 3. There are certainly times in history where you could say that that certain architects are more formally oriented, or more conceptually oriented, or more problem-solving oriented. But really the best moments in design are when the 3 are dealt with synthetically. And what we call the aesthetic aspects of design, the formal and the beautiful aspects, derive from the problem-solving and the conceptual basis of the work. It's not simply the gloss or the cover or the surface that comes afterward. In these projects that are on the screen, the High Line, for example, or the Hong Kong waterfront, or Tongva Park in Santa Monica, just for example, these are all public space designs, which adds an extra layer of complexity in this balancing act, because these aren't designed for one person or for a patron or for an institution. They're designed for everybody. And so everybody has a voice and everybody has an agenda, and somehow the balancing act is trying to resolve that in the public domain. The second point I'll make briefly is that one of the biggest issues today confronting us all is climate change, and the whole issue of how we design better cities and better communities to live in a world that's undergoing some serious challenges, not only in terms of climate, but also population growth and natural resource stresses and so on. And it's interesting that big projects, this is our work for South Bay and San Francisco Bay, these big projects are not being handed out to engineers who could probably solve the problems very well themselves, but they're being challenged by designers because of this complexity, because of the holistic range of issues that are, on the one hand, technical and pragmatic and are issue-based, on the other hand, are conceptual in terms of their cultural orientation, and on the third hand, they're formal and they require material precision and formal resolution. So that's my 2 minutes, just trying to make the point that design is holistic and not simply surface.
Well, I echo that, Mr. Weitzman. Thank you very much for believing in design. I think I can talk for my colleagues here. We've spent our whole professional career wanting design to arrive and have a seat at the table and be something that's talked about and something that's valued, and it is, finally. That said, we also are at a point today where if we don't do it right, it could just become a whim. When I look at all these weekend cams for people taking design thinking and everybody's running through thinking they're designers now, that's not the case. You know, we need to educate our students. We need to make sure that we have those, I call them the ninja warriors, to be out there and really do the interdisciplinary work, really work across barriers to get those conceptual ideas and make them real. And so I love the fact that everybody is involved, people know what's going on. I think we have done a great service in bringing design to that level. We've got to take it to the next level now. And when I look at the future, as you all do, and I look and I read about, what's going on in artificial intelligence and machine learning, one thing we know is that critical thinking skills and that creativity are the jobs of the future. So the Weitzman School is really the school to be reckoned with in several years, because those are going to be where the jobs are coming out of. These students are going to learn these critical thinking skills in ways that are going to be so important to where we're moving and how we're going to keep that human at the center of everything. Images that you're seeing here are images from our students at the University of Texas, where we are really, again, similarly doing kind of deep dives into both the physical and the digital aspects of what's going on.
So huge thank you, Stuart Weitzman, for actually believing in this school and believing in the kind of cross-disciplinary breadth and dimension by which we all engage in our ambitions about what it takes to bring design to reshape the world. And also thank you, Fritz, for sort of convening this panel, because it really is a wonderful thing to celebrate this occasion through a dialogue about important questions. So the title, Balancing Acts, is a very fitting one, because at a time when so much of the world is out of balance and at risk, this is a critical question. I'm interested in what is at stake now for designers in a century when public and natural realms are continually eroded. And it is my hunch and my belief that the social and infrastructural and natural worlds are deeply interdependent, and we see these challenges as inseparable conditions to inform our work. In the public realm, this is really a paradoxical period, because globalized urbanization and climate change, technologically enabled connectivity, and the improbable effects of social isolation are really still saying that maybe yet this is still a moment when art and ecology can become reciprocal agents in this terrain of change. So each project for us, my partner Michael Manfredi and I, find that they can be catalysts for transformation and an opportunity to introduce new terms about what is, quote, public and what is, quote, nature. So above the image above, Hunters Point South Waterfront Park, this phase 2 just recently opened, we wondered whether a strategy to protect new urban ecologies from rising sea levels and extreme flooding could also become a destination for the public to enjoy a spectacular city and perhaps walk on water. So today's projects must perform on so many different levels that any single disciplinary frame is in fact inadequate. And rather than focusing on one challenge at a time, multiple challenges can be considered as inseparable conditions to invent new public realms. There's a hunger now to bring public life to our urban waterfronts that exist, but not in a perfect state, but in infrastructurally bifurcated and contaminated states. The challenge in designing the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is above, was to bridge art, architecture, landscape, and ecology with a continuous landform transcending the infrastructural barriers that connect the city to the water's edge. These stakes are great enough now to diffuse the debate between nature versus building in the city, individual versus collective. And on Penn's campus, the debate between the sealed privacy of technical, deep laboratory research and public engagement with the university could be envisioned as reciprocal. At the Singh Center, the unseen world of research at the nanoscale, with its technical demand for vibration isolation, electromagnetic shielding, etc., is translated into an illuminated topography that is equal parts laboratory, lantern, and landscape gateway to the university. So I return to the question of what balance might mean. I believe as designers, we possess the capacity uniquely to solve multiple challenges simultaneously, invent settings informed by the art of design, yet ultimately we must remember to create places that we desire to be a part of.
Thank you. I wanted to start by asking a very basic, but I think essential question about about design that I think applies to the work of all three of the participants here. And, you know, today's designers are now expected to do everything, you know, to take into account complex societal issues like economic and racial inequities and climate change. But I know that James has talked a lot about, as a result, craft and beauty are often given short shrift. And the pressure, ironically, comes from different directions. You have people complaining that the emphasis on quality is elitist, and at the same time, you hear from developer clients who are increasingly focused on the bottom line that they can't afford it. So there's a lot of tension there, and I was wondering, Jim, where does that leave aesthetics and style in today's world? And Doreen, you know, I noticed that in some of your writings you've taken a different view, and I just want to quote from one of your articles where you wrote, design today is not just the output, the visual. We want to design to solve problems, make our lives easier. Beauty is still important, but the core of why people value design has changed. So I thought each of you could stake out your positions, and James, why don't you go first?
I don't know, actually, if they're that divergent. I mean, the point is, I think there's a common view out there that design is the surface gloss. It's not necessary. So, you know, you could design a building without necessarily an architect. In fact, many buildings are designed without architects. So, you know, what is that extra that the architectural imagination or the design imagination brings to bear on the project? And you know, it should not be viewed as the gloss or as the surface that comes afterwards. It should be viewed as the thinking that works through the issues to produce the work. So, I mean, now in business schools, they've got classes called design thinking. And in design thinking, they're trying to bring to bear how to ask questions that are perhaps a little different, how to pursue alternative ways or alternative options, how to think through possibilities, and then how to actually project something that resolves the problems but does so in an elegant way, whilst also perhaps opening new potentials as well. That's what design does. Again, I wanted to just use the engineering example because so many problems confronting the city today, let's say, for example, flood and climate change, could be dealt with purely quantitatively. You could have engineers who are perfectly capable of resolving these issues and building the sort of protections and remediative landscapes that we need. But I would argue that the solutions are fairly bland. They don't have the cultural dimensions. They're prosaic. They lack the poetics that designers can bring. So I think it's really interesting today that the design imagination is being utilized as a thinking tool to try to address issues of social equity in urban areas, of urban resiliency along shorelines, of urban issues to do with food and natural resources and transportation and housing and all of that, but to do so in a way that goes above and beyond. And that's design. Design is not simply the gloss afterwards. It's actually the holistic project.
Doreen?
Yeah, I'm going to agree. I mean, to me, I don't think it's an and, or you know, it's an or. I mean, it's not like you have design is the visual artifact, and that's what we do. I think that's what has pigeonholed us for so many years. I think designers, by their natures, are problem solvers. And the more information, the more knowledge they have about any given topic that they're working on, the more that's going to influence the output. And that output, and this is where I get back to these ninjas, the output does have to have beauty. It does have to have that emotional resonance. It does have to connect back to who is going to use this. And so the people get frustrated, developers, anybody, there's like time and money. But at the end of the day, they also want a design that is going to be utilized, a design that's going to be something that people want to be involved with. And that takes more than just the visual representation. And I feel for so many years when I first started in this industry, everybody just talked about the visual. And I think that pigeonholed designers into being paint jockeys and not being true thinkers and people that could bring something, such depth to a conversation and make such change, such profound change in what they're doing. And I think we have gotten there. Again, I love the fact that everybody's talking about it now. I just want to make sure that we don't lose the fact that we still need people who know actually how to design something. Just because you take a design thinking class, you're not a designer. That would be me taking, a business class and becoming the CFO of someplace. Like, that's not going to happen, right? But I can work my way around the spreadsheet and I understand P&L, but I'm not going to be that person. And so for me, you need both, and I think we're at that point today where that is recognized and that's accepted, and that's a good thing.
Marianne, do you want to take that on?
I think that what everybody's saying, I think, is terribly important, but I would say that there's a specificity that we need to all be very mindful of, particularly for those of us who work in the public realm or in larger projects. There is the emergence, and I would say the growing scope of what I would call the people in the middle. And the people in the middle, in a sense, are there to effectively make sure, quote, everybody is being responsible. As editors who sometimes preclude the dialogue between the very people who are designing and the very people who are designing, or the very people they're designing for, that editorial space is getting bigger and bigger. And I think that we all need to be very, very mindful of making it very clear that we need to have direct agency and access to the people who make decisions. What I find is that the more experienced and the more capable the leaders are, the more they know they don't need to count on those editorial boards that are there to keep things on time and on schedule. So I would just place that as a kind of addition to the elements that I've heard and I very much agree with, is that we do need to be vigilant about our need to be leaders.
I want to just follow up with an issue that I've been obsessed with in my own work, and that is this growing disconnect between projects that are done for public clients and projects done for private clients. Particularly right now when we're having this incredible real estate boom in cities, and anyone can be a developer, and so it seems like we're getting two tiers of design: very bespoke, wonderful designs for museums, universities, and very mediocre work for private developers. But that private development is what people experience most in their daily lives. There's so much more of it. Can you talk? I don't know how much work you do for private developers, but can you talk about how you deal with that emphasis on just the bottom line?
It's very interesting. We've only done one project for a developer, and that developer was in collaboration. In collaboration with Cornell Tech for the Tata Center for Innovation, and which is up on Roosevelt Island with Jim Corner's great landscape work. The interesting thing there was that we found that Forest City actually had more experience because of their work with Frank Gehry and Renzo Piano that preceded our project with them, that they were actually ahead of the curve in terms of their expectations. But what they did know is they knew how to get to the very, very best people to do their best work, and because they always did great work, we were fortunate by the relationships that they had built up. So I would say I think we had a very unique first experience working with the developer, so I couldn't speak with authority about the others.
Well, you're right. I mean, you could say there's three types of client generally. The institutions, and those I would argue are probably the best because they really care about the uniqueness and the quality of the product. The private developers who can, as you say, think about the bottom line, but they are also thinking about how to add value so that their product is somehow more valuable than their competitor. And you could argue that unfortunately a lot of that value is in surface gloss. It's not necessarily in the bones or in the program of the building, but it's in the surface finish and the look of the building, or in some random menu of amenities like a rooftop garden and a swimming pool and a gym and this sort of thing. The most difficult client are the ones that occupy 70% of our workload, which is the public client, because it's inevitably open to everybody's opinion and everybody's agenda. And design is rendered, if you bring design with a capital D, it's rendered very suspicious by people. They think that somehow there is a kind of elitism, and there is a kind of hidden agenda behind a designer designing public space. There's a reason most sidewalks in Manhattan are cast-in-place concrete. It's because it's seen as being the ultimate democratic sidewalk. It has no ostentation, it has no pretension, it has no meaning beyond and above its pure, brutal function. And you know, we're often confronted with that with public space projects, that they want, on the one hand, they want something cool and effective, but on the other hand, they're very suspicious of design. And so for a design to be effective in the public realm, it really does have to balance the various factors and really does have to be argued for and presented and rationalized on the basis of the real issues that are confronting that particular community at that particular time.
No, I was going to say, you know, I don't work in the architecture space, but I have seen this for many, many years, where until we begin to show the true value, and so people will always go and manage design from the bottom line if you're in business. And I think that's part of the designers having that seat at the table, having that value, having the understanding to really go and explain what that value is and to show it, you know, to begin to show it in small. I always tell people, go in and show it in small little chunks, in bites, so they understand it. Because until we're going to have that breakthrough, we've seen it a lot in product development and other areas, that breakthrough will come when they begin to see, oh, there's a value to that. Because right now they're just looking at a bottom line and not understanding why it becomes mediocrity and they don't become someone that rises to the top. I believe that design and the understanding on how designers really go and explain that could make that change.
Mm-hmm. I think that what's very interesting about what both Jim and Doreen are saying is that as designers, we actually have to be incredibly articulate advocates, both in our words and in our images and in the models by which we share the potential futures that have yet to be realized. I think that the tools at our disposal have never been better, but what's now happened with the ubiquity of these tools is that the flash of images has become, in a sense, numbing by the generosity by which we're absorbing these on a daily basis. So the real question then is distinction within that. And I think that one of the great opportunities that we have as designers is to identify, quote, options, but lead to perhaps a more teleological conclusion that we can all share, that if you're fortunate, actually tends to be the one that costs less to get the buy-in for those who actually don't care about design. And they're plentiful at the table. And so we're doing the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India right now, and as you can imagine, the U.S. government has a great deal of concern about that bottom line. But what we've also been able to explain is, over a 6-year period, escalation is so great that if you did the project as planned over 10 years, you would lose the value that actually by doing it in a different way would realize 3 more buildings and 12 more acres of landscape, which is what we're starting construction on right now. So I do think that if we're at the table soon enough, we can actually recast these terms and actually have better solutions maybe than the very people who are writing the first script.
Did you succeed in making that case?
Yes, it started construction. They're having the groundbreaking in January, but it's actually mobilized right now.
Oh, that's great. So just to switch topics a little bit, it seems like only a few years ago that designers were very, very excited about bringing technology into public spaces. And I remember hearing how great it was going to be that we could all bring our laptops to the local park and do work, and that the internet would allow us to access all sorts of information about where we were and what restaurants nearby, and et cetera, et cetera. And now many of us, I think, at least for me, are starting to feel overwhelmed by constant connectivity, by all the advertising screens that are trying to claim our eyeballs, as well as the constant presence of various forms of surveillance. So, all of you work in public space and with technology, and so I was wondering, how you're feeling about the way technology was promoted a few years ago, how you're feeling about it now, and, how you're trying to talk to clients about that. So maybe, Doreen, you're the tech person.
So here's my news flash. It's not going to go away. So technology is here to stay. We might not like where we ended up right now, and I can probably say I don't like where we ended up right now, but it's here to stay. But there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity from a design perspective to make that change. And I think that's the next iteration of this, is how do we begin to make this more pleasurable, less intrusive, something that really truly does bring value to an individual, and not only this, I call it harassment right now, and we move away. But I think that's a design opportunity, that's a design challenge, and I do believe smart minds, people will break that code.
Can you give some specifics about what form that might take?
I'll go through, our glasses. I mean, I was, with a company recently, and you know what? It's this. And I can turn it on and kind of take a look at it and see things that are relevant, that I'm more important to me. That's an interesting concept, right? I also think when we begin to look at space, our space could be adapted through this glasses, through the AR, VR, to something that we want at that moment. So I think when we begin to look at where this is going, if we can control it more, I think putting the control back into the user's hands, which is what users like in general, right? That's something that's good for me. We know that. We know that from a design perspective. That's where the sea change is going to happen. Right now, it's like fighting for noise. It's just everybody's out there just throwing all these technologies out there, and we don't really know what that means. But I think as we begin to get more specific and it becomes more meaningful to the individual user, it will be much more impactful.
I think in relationship to public space, we just completed a project in Hong Kong, which is on the waterfront, on the harbour front. And it's public space. It's a very large garden and then a very large promenade, extensive promenade for strolling. In Hong Kong, of course, a lot of people don't come out until the evening when it's cooler, the temperature is cooler. And because the client was also a commercial client, they were very interested in media screens. So we actually have a lot of these various media screens. Some of them are for advertising, some of them are for film and for art, rotating art installations, and some are for interactive facility. You can go up to the screen in a particular way and it projects your body onto another screen. And in the public realm, people get a kick out of this sort of interactivity that's enabled by technology. There's Wi-Fi ports and there's plug-in ports and there's all of this. On the other hand, the idea of the garden or the park in the city is that it's a place of respite. It's a place to actually escape all the noise of the city and to be in a completely another realm of experience. I remember designing the High Line, and there was a lot of pressure to have plug-in installs and media screens and a lot of other things flashing lights. People during the design did not believe that a strolling path in a garden was sufficient. They wanted more spectacle, and there was a lot of pressure to do more with lighting, to do more with media, to do more with technology. And we kept it, fortunately, quiet, and that's where I think a lot of people derive their delight. It's a delightful escape from the city. It's not quite an escape, because you always feel immersed in the city at the same time. But I think there are some projects that warrant technological innovation, working with media, working with new effects that are enabled through digital technology in particular. And there are other projects that warrant total respite and simplicity and escape from all of the noise.
Marion, how do you feel about screens in your projects, especially your outdoor projects?
It's very interesting. We don't have any screens in our outdoor projects.
How did you do that?
And we suggested that they could be temporal things for temporal moments, but that the point of these projects were a place of escape. But I will say that there's something very interesting going on. The kind of fluency that kids growing up now and have with technology is that it really is just a second skin. And as a second skin, it's less invasive for folks growing up with it than maybe the way it's appeared as it came on the scene, some 20 plus years ago. The thing that I find very interesting is that the very generation for whom it is in their skin are also craving deeply the oddest forms and expressions of authenticity, so much so that they could even have an iPhone case that's made out of distressed driftwood to give it that authenticity. So I think that this hunger, if you will, almost simulation of tactile authenticity with black and steel, distressed wood, Edison light bulbs in the coffee houses that they go to, all of these things are saying that there's a hearkening to be able to have both.
But they still want the screens.
But they still want their
with
screens.
the distressed wood.
With the driftwood case, exactly.
I do think, and I was going to comment on that, so I'm glad you said, Marion. I do think sometimes, not insulting my panelists, but we do kind of show our age a little bit because it is a second skin to them. And I think some of the things we worry so much about, they find balance. They, interestingly enough, find some balance also with their big record players and everything else that they're using. So as long as we keep presenting options, but as I said, the technology for me, the screens they're not going to go away. Like, we just have to, from a design perspective, figure out how to use them better.
I'd just also add that it's not just technology as screen and iPhone and internet. It's also technology in the medium with which we're building. So there's some very interesting work in architectural research right now called material ecology, where they're using a combination of biological organisms along with robotic organisms to actually build new structures. And the same with landscape technology, where new materials and new mixtures of ingredients are actually producing new types of ecosystem that are really useful in terms of the challenges we face with regards to food, efficient food production, or stormwater management, or dealing with flood, or this sort of thing. So the technological is not simply, again, a surface. It's actually embodied in our media. And I think there are some very interesting things happening that are particularly innovative in terms of new materials and new ways of thinking about how we actually build the world.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that technology was bad. I mean, it's definitely made our lives better in hundreds, thousands of ways. I don't know if anyone, maybe Doreen, want to take up the issue of surveillance and facial recognition, and I think this goes to public spaces. As that technology becomes better and better, can we ever escape?
That's a really good point, and it's something certainly that's troubled me because we live in the world of Dr. Strangelove, so to speak, right? And we know that surveillance and facial recognition could be used for very good things, but it also could be used for very bad things. So what are the parameters around that? And we have not figured that out. There are no regulations around that right now, and that's for me the scary part.
It is racing ahead, and
yeah, it definitely is racing ahead of technology, and the fact that you can go to cities and places and they're deploying this facial recognition and using it not for good. And we know that facial recognition, like all emerging technologies, is flawed. Is a really big problem. It's a really, really big problem. And so, again, I think as a design community, that's where we have to jump on the bandwagon and get in there and try to fix it as soon as possible. Because when you look at all these organizations, these security organizations and companies that are forming, that are doing this, we need to get in front of it because it's going fast.
I think that what you're touching on, Inga and Doreen, really is the underpinning of what's at stake here, which is that there's an ethical dimension to things that have been invented that have yet to be understood the impact of their full deployment. And the people who are actually able to deploy them can deploy them at such great scale that, in fact, there needs to be, I would say, pilot projects that actually come forward to both identify capacities that have yet to be tapped into that are extraordinary about it, but maybe mitigating impacts to be able to address the fact that there's some runaway corners that we have yet to understand.
yeah. And designers are, of course, only one small corner of this.
They are, but I think I think you really bring a terrific point up about the ethical side of this. Is just something that, I don't think we assumed and we knew, but it is something I think we're seeing in today's education that's being taught now. Like, we have to pay attention to the ethical implications of what all this technology has brought to us. And I think some of our digital natives, our young students, it's just, they grew up with this stuff. They think it's normal, but it's very invasive and it can be damaging.
That sort of brings me to this next issue, which deals with issues of equity. And I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, that the fear of gentrification and displacement is now so great in so many cities, especially in neighborhoods of color, that we're hearing about cases where people reject proposed improvements because they feel it will accelerate neighborhood change. And I was wondering if any of you have encountered this and what kind of strategies you would use to make people feel more comfortable. Marion, you talked a little bit before about public engagement. I was wondering if that's come up in some of your projects.
It's actually come up very specifically, most recently at Hunters Point South Waterfront Park, and that was a case where Mayor Bloomberg determined that there would be a park first, and there would be the largest scale collection of affordable housing in New York since the 70s. And it was a complete declaration that the design and the ambitions of design would be for that community first, with the park arriving before the towers would follow. And I think that it has to come from the very, very top, because there's no way a designer can, in fact, dissuade anybody from the fact that these kind of public improvements aren't going to change values, and they aren't going to drive the values up to a point that it may, in fact, have the backlash of gentrification. So it takes highly intentional planning, I think, at a government level, to make sure that both can be considered together.
Was that enough to put people at ease?
I think they were thrilled, because indeed the park was theirs first, and there was a full understanding that what would follow had and must need to, and de Blasio's continuing that, must indeed be part of this largest 4,000 unit affordable housing in New York City.
James, have you had that experience at all?
Oh, it's pervasive, and it's a real issue. My own view is that you have to understand that cities are, by default, economic machines. I mean, it's all about capital. And so if you want better schools and better parks and better investment in public facilities, there needs to be an economic win somewhere. That's typically economic development of some sort. So, I mean, the whole Bloomberg initiative, with all of his Manhattan-based projects mostly, was that would give his bucket a lot of cash to then distribute to some of the poorer neighborhoods and to build new schools and to provide new parks and to improve the neighborhood for some of the poorer parts of the sector. So this is what makes it complicated, because the notion that you don't do anything will just lead to a stasis where there's you know, and a competitive disadvantage over time. The notion that you completely overhaul a city solely for economic gain without an equitable plan for distributing the wealth from that gain. These are the balancing acts, and I think a lot of these initiatives could be better explained to people in terms of why certain types of development are good for the city as a whole, and how people can gain from that instead of feel like they're always losing.
Doreen, does this come up in your...
Well, the city that I live in right now is absolutely, and I actually sit on a committee with the mayor's office around this, but because we are a city known for artists and musicians, and as the city becomes this technology magnet, we're driving them out, right? They don't have the places to live. It was once an inexpensive city. It's no longer an inexpensive city to live in. And so a lot of this, to me, is, oh, we got to stop and do something. It's what you know, it's like pay attention to how development happens. Pay attention to, yes, there's economic benefits, but we also, the people that are directly impacted, we don't want to drive them out. So what can we do? How do we have both? So it's an and again, not an or. How do we have both? And there's been a lot of opportunities now building affordable housing, particularly for artists and musicians, which is pretty
in Austin.
In Austin, pretty exciting right now. And also paying attention to not just doing development for the sake of just bringing in more money, but how do you keep the essence and the culture of a city alive?
And in Austin, you're not just talking about building housing for the very poor, but for the workforce housing.
For the workforce housing too, which has become, you know, people travel up to, you know, an hour and a half to commute into the city.
Right. Related to this is a kind of delicate question. You know, everyone believes in public engagement and talking to as many people who are going to be users of the project as possible. And that's really, really important and something that wasn't done enough in the past. But at the same time, you know, people have funny ideas. And I see this a lot in Philadelphia where, you know, the housing authority will redo a public housing project and people will insist on a giant surface parking lot. That's what they want. Or they want to tear down a great building so they can have a dog park. So Marion, you look like you have some more stories about public engagement. Let's hear it.
You know, public engagement, I think, is incredibly important because sometimes the very best ideas do come out of the corners of conversations that nobody is ever expecting. But it is true that we've been to many hearings that go very, very late into the night. You mentioned the dog park. We had a dog park in the Hunters Point South Park. That seemed fine. No, it was very clear there had to be a little dog and a big dog section.
Right.
That generated 200 people to make that clear. Then after that, it was generating yet another discussion because it was clear that there needed to be a third area separate from the small and the large dogs, which was for aggressive dogs. And so, at the end of the day, I think that one of the most effective tools that we all have is to say that we have both footprint and budget constraints, and while these are terrific ideas, they might not all be able to fit into the given project that we're tasked to do. And that's been, at the end of the day, the only effective way we've been able to say no to some extraordinary ideas.
What did you end up with? Just small and what did you end up with?
Small and large, but with shade structures and separate drinking fountains.
Okay.
Yes.
No, it's a crazy world out there. Look, if you're designing in the public sector, you have an obligation to engage the public and to do it in as generous and as authentic and as sincere a way as possible. But you also want to lead the discussion through design. You want to inspire. I mean, the big famous phrase of Steve Jobs, who said, you know, we're not designing based on any market research or any poll or any analysis, you know. We're going to design something that people don't even know they need yet. We're going to invent something. And that is a very proactive, creative stance to take, as opposed to, I'm going to sit back and ask you what you want, and then I'll try and figure it out for you. Because people, I mean, the whole notion of the design imagination is we're able to think or conjure up futures that are a little bit more visionary, a little bit more unexpected than your typical person. And that's not to denigrate that person, that's simply to say that the whole idea of a design education and design training is to expand the worlds of possibility and to bring those worlds of possibility forward. So when we're engaged with the public, we do listen, we ask lots of questions, we participate, but we also try to lead and inspire the conversation so it doesn't get stuck and lost in the weeds. And quite frankly, a lot of public process can lead to very bland work. Because bland is what most people feel comfortable with. It's vanilla, it's what they've seen before. It's vanilla ice cream and it's vanilla color, and that's all good because it's not radical. But in our experience, when you meet with people and you start to raise their expectations and you start to raise their field of possibility, they can get quite excited about a much more innovative design approach to the public realm.
Does it help to show something really daring in the beginning?
No.
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 You have to show them that you're actually evolving a set of ideas that came out of the early conversations. And just raise the bar of that discussion. The first meetings will be about dog parks and bicycles and parking and not in my backyard. I mean, it's prototypical and it's to be expected. But, you know, once you begin to get over that, you can begin to speak about the site, about the locality, about local history, about a whole nother set of ideas that begins to capture people's imaginations in a much more nuanced way and allows you to body forth a design that's fresh.
You know what? Designers have like an incredible superpower, and this is where you use the and the superpower is insights. So people are going to say a whole bunch of things to you. What you're watching is behaviors. What is really the problem you're trying to solve for? And great designers get to that. And you understand what that problem is you're trying to solve for, who you should solve it for, and is it worth solving, right? So designers kind of go through that iteration all the time as they get this onslaught of gray or vanilla that's constantly thrown at them to come up with really understanding what is really the insight we're trying to get. And I think that's the superpower that designers use all the time. And that's when they come up with this truly magical transformations.
I think, you know, just to add to what Doreen's saying, I do think that what architects do, what landscape architects do, what designers do, what even graphic designers do is that they take a disparate set of a menu of impossible and improbable things that need to be solved all at once and think about something that is so essential and imaginative that either it does answer all those things all at once, or it basically says, actually, there's a different question at stake. Exactly. And I think for us, half the time we really listen very, very hard to figure out if in fact there should be an entirely different question at stake. We've done so, I think, in one case where we felt very badly, but we had to tell the client that their master plan had identified the entirely wrong site for a project. So at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we relocated the site to the edge of the city instead of the center of the parking lot. So sometimes you just need to kind of dig in and listen, and you discover that they really want something else, but they framed the problem in a way that doesn't support that.
Right, right, right. So we just have like a minute or two. Is there any other thoughts you have on that particular issue or any of the other issues that we talked about? Are we good? Yeah, well, thank you very much. Let's thank the panelists.
Yes, please join me again in thanking Inga Saffron, James Corner, Marion Weiss, and Doreen Lorenzo for such a wonderful panel. As we're making this transition from one panel to another, I look out and there's so many really important people in the audience, but I'd like to just acknowledge one. Our previous dean, Gary Hack, has come down from Maine today. Gary was dean of the school from 1996 to 2008. So we're going to transition to the next panel now. For those that weren't here for the first panel, my name is Fritz Steiner, and I'm the Dean and the Padley Professor here in the Stuart Weitzman School of Design. So I want to welcome everyone to the celebration of design. Today we're here celebrating our new name, the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and honoring Stuart Weitzman and his family, who are here with us in the audience. So welcome, Stuart and your family. And we appreciate your profound commitment to the success of our mission, to our students, and to our faculty. Thanks to Stuart's transformational support, the school is poised to be even more eminent leader among schools of architecture, landscape architecture, city planning, historic preservation, and the fine arts. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Lisa Servon. Lisa is the Kevin and Erica Penn Presidential Professor and Chair of our school's City and Regional Planning Department. She conducts research in areas including urban poverty, community and economic development, and issues of gender and race. Lisa?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Stuart, so much for your generous gift. I can tell you as chair of planning that it has already been transformative in terms of the students we've brought in. So my classroom is much richer as a result. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is a really interesting panel and topic, I think, and I'm looking forward to moderating the conversation. You have longer bios of all of the speakers in your program, so I just want to say one sentence about each to kick us off. To my left is Christian Benimana, who is a senior principal and managing director at Mass Design Group, a nonprofit architectural organization that advocates for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. Sharon Hayes is an associate professor in the Fine Arts Department here at the Weitzman School of Design. She's also an artist who works in video, performance, and installation, examining the intersections between history, politics, and speech. And Randy Mason is an associate professor of historic preservation and city planning here at the Weitzman School. His research and practice includes work at many scales addressing preservation, planning, and public space issues. And all three of our panelists are engaged in work that connects to our topic this afternoon. So thank you all for being here today. The topic of monuments and memorials seems to have taken on a new urgency in the past couple of years. We see heated debates taking place in many cities over whether particular monuments that have existed for decades are still appropriate, for example. And memorials are taking new and different forms. A wider group of people is involved in their construction. So the first question I'd like to throw out to the panelists has to do with the language we're using to talk about these things, and specifically how we define monuments and memorials. So I'm wondering if each of you could talk for a moment about how you define monuments and memorials and how you distinguish between the two. Christian, do you want to start, since you're right next to me?
Sure. I think from us, like architects, it's the differentiation in the past has been purely from a typological sense of definition, where monuments are more used to kind of like honor or celebrate like a certain person or a certain event that we deem necessary, while memorials seem more like to attach to, to engage with a certain memory in a didactic kind of like a way.
Mm-hmm. I was hoping you would go next, because you can pass if you want. I think mine's not working. Okay, perfect. I was hoping you would go first because I have a sense that you have also, like Christian, a kind of sense of delineation. Mine is not working. Now it's working? Okay.
I'll take the pass. So I usually, I'm confused about what is a monument and what is a memorial and how you tell the difference between the two. And I think it's a kind of a fraught and maybe a questionable question about how much time we spend talking about types and working on working from those kinds of decisions. The starting point that often comes to my mind is a quote that I won't read, but I'll try to get right, more right than not, from Arthur Danto. He's an art critic, and he was writing about Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He made the distinction that we build monuments so that we always remember, and we build memorials so that we never forget. Now, it's taken me 25 years to think about what that might mean, and I'm still working on it. But I think one of the things that we all can take away from that nuanced distinction, or maybe lack of distinction, is that there is a process of remembering and forgetting, of inscribing and erasing. Talk about it in whatever terms, material or immaterial, you want to, but that it's a social process, and it's not only about things, but about what we ask things to do. And it kind of opens us to a whole range of different phenomena and different practices, as well as different types and objects and places, that I think really opens the ground for architects, artists, conservators, planners, designers, to all have a purchase on the responsibility to do this work for the public.
Right. Yeah, I think this is not working. I think it comes and goes. Thank you, Randy. I think that for me, there is quite a bit of confusion or conflation. Certainly, if we think of these terms also as not something that we can hold or own and or define for ourselves, but that they're constantly being defined by how they're taken up by others, by multiple publics and in multiple discursive realms. So I think there's a lot of conflation, and in some ways what I find helpful about the conflation, and I would maybe add some aspects of historic preservation into that too. So a house museum, a home museum, a historic site, that the historic site, the monument, and the memorial are often sort of fused. What I find helpful about that conflation is that it also puts the terms of remembering and forgetting and the operations of remembering and forgetting into a state of, into the position of a question. So how do we remember? The Danto quote is quite interesting because in my passage into digging deeply into monuments, I could argue also that they serve to help us forget rather than to help us remember. But I have also learned a lot about thinking about preservation movements and the sort of impetus, desire, and infrastructural and economic and civic formulations to support a preservation movement as well.
Could you just, I think that's so interesting, could you say one more thing about that, keep the mic, about the helping us to forget, because I think let's pause on that for a moment. So I have an idea of what you mean by that, but I'd love for you to expand on it a little bit.
Well, maybe the most clear sort of example to give, not to send us straight into the deepest of the conflicts, is around the Confederacy, the erecting of Confederate monuments, and particularly the erecting of Confederate monuments as a tool for what we know of as the Lost Cause movement. So a movement where, in fact, while it appears to be about the preservation of history, it is also about the erasure of a present moment and a present set of political possibilities, and the sort of retroactive erasure of many histories that brought that present moment to bear.
Right, thank you. The other thing I'd like you to kind of talk about a little bit as a group individually before we talk about your specific work as artist, architect, preservationist is this idea of the dynamism of history, right? So we think of monuments perhaps as being intended to recognize and preserve the legacy of someone or something that we think is worth of honoring, yet our opinions of what we deem worthy changes over time, right? That's the root of some of this. Do we keep it? Do we remove it? what is happening there. And so we've seen recently in debates over Confederate monuments, which we've mentioned, and even right here in Philadelphia, we have a statue of former Mayor Frank Rizzo, memorials and monuments that are created at a moment in time, but our understanding of the past tends to be dynamic. So existing monuments are also reflect the power structure of the time in which they were built. Who got a say in terms of who or what was memorialized. And so in terms of the work that each of you do, how have you thought about the publics for which they are being built, and who are these monuments for? Big question, I know. Yes. Maybe, a way to make it a little more specific is to talk about how you've grappled with the notions of audience, right?
Well, I can start and simply say I'm up in this panel because I was invited by two curators, Ken Lum and Paul Farber, to make a temporary monument for an exhibition called Monument Lab that took place in Philadelphia in 2017. I hadn't heretofore spent a ton of time as an artist working on monuments. My first sort of step into it in some ways came with a lot of really important revelations. One being that while monuments are born, I agree, out of a very specific set of power, sort of economic, social, political, cultural conditions, they also tend to erase the conflict that existed at their inception, that very often there was all sorts of conflict at the inception of these monuments, the Confederate monuments to begin with. So what I mean by that is people at the time who did not want them erected. So I think our ideas of progressive or how time works or how historical time works, for me, became really importantly or generatively challenged in working in the space of monuments. So I think very often what we think of as a public project is in fact the invested sort of desires of a small group of people who have the economic and the political means and the access to labor, time, and effort to be advocates for this object to be erected. And then, I mean, it's hard to kind of sum it up because it happens so differently in different moments, but I think I have come to be led by these questions into that in a way it really is impossible to talk about the public, that it really is a kind of multiplicity of gatherings, some of which are speculative, an object that shows up to actually in a futurity, in the sense of futurity, to project a public that doesn't yet exist.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think in our work, we definitely haven't worked in a lot of monuments work so far. I think I can only think of one project, but in our work in memorials, I think it has manifested in a deep reflection of our role as architects and how we engage with this notion of public or community or environment. Because for the past, I think, 60 years, there's been this tendency of architects engaging with this topic in a disconnected way, where we talk about this construct as detached to us and our work, as detached to us as individuals, and only relevant as a source of information that feeds into our work. And I think what we're trying to do is to reflect on and be realistic about ourselves, about how effective can our work be if we continue engaging with these topics, think about these publics as disconnected from us as people, as individuals, and as professionals. And the example I always give to people when I talk about this issue is an example of rituals of passage that used to exist in some societies on the African continent, where at a certain age, if you're a young man or a young woman, you will have to go through a series of or tests or rituals that allow you to be accepted as a member of the community. And what we found out was that until we and architects and designers are able to also go through some sort of reckoning with those issues to a deeper spiritual level that is attached and connected to us, then we can't really begin to decide what public it is intended for, what public isn't intended for, in what ways. Because we're kind of like still like also like outsiders of that, and whatever comes out of that work is still meaningless because it's not coming from we as a member of that public itself.
So you have to kind of collapse the distance, intentionally collapse the distance.
Right.
Yeah.
We use a term where we say like, we have to be proximate
Yeah.
for us to be able to engage with that you call public or community or whatever it is, but in a way that we are a member of that, and this is our issue as well. And our work is our technical capabilities of doing something about it, but our primary role is a contribution as a member of that community, of that public, to solve that issue and move the society in a positive direction.
Well, it'll be great to see you talk about it with the images. Randy.
The most striking thing to me about audience, to go back to your question, is that audiences, the reality is that we need to deal with lots of audiences in every gesture we make, whether we call it a monument or call it a memorial. Mm-hmm. That's in dramatic contrast to those ones we've received from the past, the ones made in bronze, so that you always look up to the military figure on the horse, that kind of canonical monument figure. What's the monument or the memorial that says the most about our moment? I won't ask you, but think. I think of the various disaster memorials in this country of the last 15 years. Oklahoma City, Flight 93, 9/11 in New York. Those are such multifaceted places where so many different things are happening. There's so many different attitudes toward the artifact, toward the process of remembering and forgetting. There's so many different expectations about that different audiences will be addressed and satisfied politically, artistically, experientially, that we have these incredibly complex problems to solve, to go back to the previous panel.
Yeah.
And they're very much like extreme versions of public space issues.
Right.
And the politics between those different audiences, it's not just more is better, more is more complicated. I think it's ultimately a good thing because it brings memorials and monuments closer into the center of the political issues that we need to face as a country or a world or a city as you have it. And it makes it clear that monuments and memorials are an enormous political issue shared way beyond our professional capabilities.
Right. Well, thank you. Let's look at some images. Let's put up, see if I can do this. So Sharon, your piece for the Monument Lab installation, which you just mentioned, took place here in Philadelphia 2 years ago, and it called attention to the near absence of women in Philadelphia's hundreds of monuments. I mean, the inscription on the base of your piece includes 78 names of women who you propose could have had a statue, and the sentence there begins, on this site, there could be a statue too, and then the 78 names, which include some recognizable blank spaces for insertion, for really, I suppose, participation of the viewer to think about who else might be there. Can you talk about the forces that resulted in the absence of women? And, when we talked earlier, we talked a little bit about what we can do to perhaps catalyze a different kind of conversation around what to do about that absence now, right? I think a little bit about, there's been a lot in the news this week about Kehinde Wiley's statue that's right now in Times Square, moving to Virginia, that kind of uses the form, this, the bronze guy on a horse, right? And yet it's inverting it to some extent. Certainly that's one way to rectify the problem, but obviously there are others. Here, I'm going to give you the clicker.
Okay. And it goes to the right? Is that right? Yeah. So these are the two statues that currently exist in Philadelphia that are dedicated to a historic figure that is a woman, so a woman that actually lived. There are plenty of embodiments of a woman in figuration or archetype, of course, but that's Joan of Arc on the right, and that's Mary Dyer on the left. And there's maybe two things to mark as I sort of talk about the obstacles. One is that to be invited to participate in this project, I was immediately interested not in making an artwork, but in making a temporary monument. And that might be a specious sort of distinction, but if you can allow it for a moment, because it becomes important to how I think of monuments in total. To make a temporary monument meant that I had to also be confronted as soon as all of us, as soon as we walk and think or pay particular attention to the field of monuments in this city, in other cities in the US, you're confronted with all sorts of exclusions, a whole field of exclusions. The one for me that became interesting is this exclusion of monuments to women. So one of the sort of fundamental reversals that I talked about is I think we make an assumption that women were excluded from this genre of aesthetic culture because they didn't have political power at that time, which of course isn't actually true. White women in particular were at the core and played an incredibly pivotal role in erecting monuments in the US. So the 700 plus monuments to the Confederacy, the majority of them were erected by a civic organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, were responsible for a whole host of other monuments across the country, as well as a number of different ladies' auxiliary committees in cities and towns all over. So for me, there's an immediate question. Okay, so what do I do with the fact that white women actually erected many of these monuments? Why did that happen? What was that about? For me, there is in that then a turn from thinking of monuments and the erecting of monuments from a historic project to a political project. So it is not, for me, a historic project, but rather a political project. And these white women were invested in the political project of what I could call white patriarchy. So the only figure that I can comfortably say is not excluded from monuments is the white patriarch. And I'll call it a white patriarch instead of a white man because it is perhaps as fictional to white maleness as it could be. But that, for me, created a kind of foundation of trying to think through that this exclusion, this persistent, insistent, kind of total exclusion cannot be repaired, but rather has to be made evident, or that I was interested in these kind of spaces of making something evident, using the temporary monument to call up recognition of absence rather than to replace it with presence. So on the base of the monument on this site, there could be a monument, a statue too, and then a list of names. The other exclusion, the other obstacles, I think, or to speak of obstacles to why women are not represented in this genre of aesthetic culture, is to run into a whole host of obstacles around history, the historical record. So to think, for instance, Notike is a Lenni Lenape woman, very often in terms of the settler impulse to report on these first encounters with the Lenni Lenape, there was a persistent unintelligibility that the settlers, the Swedish settlers, the Dutch settlers, the English settlers could not read the relationship or the political power of Lenni Lenape women. So that is linked to a kind of marking of language and culture and its inability to sort of see or prescribe. I also think there's three other obstacles to throw out. One is that the radicality often of women who were acting in public life because there were all sorts of spheres of violence to a woman speaking in public, for instance. Very often her gesture into that space might only last for 4 public speeches. Maria W. Stewart, who was an early black woman who spoke out in the mid-19th century, for instance, spoke 4 times, but then did not continue that practice. So this level of scale and this sort of impact, or this idea of measuring impact, how much has someone given, for how long, how many times, becomes an obstacle to recognizing really important actions that may not have had a volumetric measure. The other thing I think that is important another important obstacle is the individual act versus the collective act, that there becomes a way that very often a lot of the political, economic, spiritual, literary contributions that women were making were collective. And in fact, also in this city, there was a huge, huge circuit of mutual aid societies, for instance, that were largely run and protected and advocated by the money of women in Philadelphia, free black women in particular. And how does one recognize that through this sort of genre that tends to elevate a single figure? So those are some of the obstacles. What I became interested in was providing, in essence, a kind of platform, or to use multiple pedestals drawn from pedestals around the city that hold statues of men, rendering them at half size, and then creating a kind of composite that I left in Rittenhouse for 2 months, 2.5 months, for it to be used however it might be used in the space of Rittenhouse. My interest in particular in it becoming a kind of stage or a platform for which people could take over.
Awesome, thank you. So Randy, you might want to, should we go to the next slide here? So Randy, you've been working in Rwanda for the past few years on memorials that help us to remember the genocide that happened there in 1994. You've talked about sites like the Nyamata Church you've worked on near Kigali as a kind of traumatic heritage. Can you say a bit more about that term and the importance of preserving places like this?
Sure. First, I feel like I should just pass the microphone to my colleague, my Rwandan colleague, Christian, to tell you anything there is to know about these places, because I am, an obvious outsider. But I have to say that it's been the experience of working on Nyamata and other places the last 4 or 5 years has been really transformative for me personally, and just an incredible education shedding light on a lot of these issues that we're talking about, of how heritage gets made and how these places are expected to be useful for people, and not just to be things that we protect and set aside and maybe occasionally look at, but really things that are actively used. Mm-hmm. The Rwandan memorials to the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994 are incredibly important and central places in Rwandan society. They are now, they were, as they were made in the last 20, 25 years, they will be in the future. Our role as invited to work with the Rwandan government to help conserve them sounds simple on the surface of it, but gets very quickly into all the complexities. What we've learned, I think, or what I've learned maybe, is that, and I'll borrow a word directly from Sharon, is that these places are important first and foremost because they're platforms for the kind of social rituals, to borrow a word from Christian, processes of mourning, processes of celebration in some sense, celebration of resilience of the society, but also the more obvious kind of historical and cultural markers of a period of intense and transformative violence. So it's a site of traumatic heritage in that kind of obvious sense that there was a great deal of violence perpetrated at this site. I think of them as these and other places, and I actually, in this category of traumatic heritage place, I also include memorials like Flight 93 or 9/11, Oklahoma City, but also places like Eastern State Penitentiary, where maybe the most obvious and the most hidden traumas that a society has encountered are given are provided a place where people can go and experience them in some more or less direct way, mm-hmm. by seeing artifacts, by being in the actual site where these things happened, but also to begin to process them and heal from them. Yeah. So the idea of it being a platform for a lot of different things, not just being witness to history or accepting a didactic lesson that other traditional kinds of monuments are made to do. I promise I won't talk for as long about each slide. One of the most interesting and difficult, and I think touching things about Nyamata specifically is the collection of textiles that were clothes of the victims who met their end at this site. And they present a really tough conservation problem in that they are ephemeral. They are ordinary clothes of ordinary people. They have been sitting out on display, doing their heritage work, and providing this resource for people mourning, people remembering the genocide against the Tutsi. They're disappearing.
Oh, I think the mic went off for a sec, but now.
Sorry. How's that?
It's good now, right?
Yeah, the clothes themselves are deteriorating and disappearing. So one of our challenges is to try to find ways to slow down the deterioration so that future generations of Rwandans will have these things, these materials, to do their commemoration, to do their remembering and their forgetting in whatever measure they decide. So we try to kind of step back and not write the script or affect the script, but to try to create the platform and to sustain the space where Rwandans for different reasons, and outsiders for another set of different reasons, tourists, scholars, others can use this place in their own way and meet that test of satisfying the needs of different audiences.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let's come back to that. Is that okay?
Should we? Sure, okay. Yeah, it's an intriguing, provocative image, right? So I'll ask Christian to say a few words first. First off, it seems that everybody has a different opinion about how to translate a difficult moment into a physical built edifice or monument. So I'm wondering, in your work, how are you engaging in a critical conversation about architectural education, the role of the architect, and how that discipline, the discipline of architecture, can contribute to this debate? And I'll just kind of add the next piece on, since we're looking at some of your work now. In so many of the current debates we're having, as a culture, the issues are contested, like these Confederate monuments. And I think the work that you've done on the Gun Violence Memorial Project is another one of those, in the sense that this is a hot button political issue at this moment, right? So I'm wondering if you can speak to how you dealt with that in this particular project, but also in as part of the kind of conversation or discourse around the other work.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe before I start talking about that precisely, I want to talk a little bit about something Rendo just mentioned on the work they're doing in Nyamata, and then talk about the caption on this slide, Justice is Beauty, and the philosophy, I think, around our practice that has enabled us to try to think about this way, and then I'll jump very quickly into talking about that project. So I think the only thing I will add to the image Rendo showed is a little bit of context so you can understand. That place that he showed is a church, a Roman Catholic church, where people took refuge seeking protection, and it ended up being a place where they got murdered. So I think, like, in preserving, I think Rendo used a sentence that I loved a little bit when we were talking earlier about, like, how can we do something without doing nothing? And I think what that communicates, the many layers that site can communicate to you when you understand the context, touches a little bit of sensitive issues that are political, that are power structures, that are religious beliefs. Like, it tests almost everything that we are conditioned to believe in and to take safety from as humans. So, and then I will jump very quickly into what justice is beauty means. Is that, so basically our practice is founded on this idea that wherever we are, individuals in our professions, we always seek that comfort zone. And whenever we meet these testing issues, our first reaction is to run to safety. Mm-hmm. And I think I don't want to speak to all architects, but I will comfortably say that in the past 100 years, architects have really taken refuge into a safety moment where we've shielded ourselves away from utilizing our platform to address very sensitive, very difficult issues. So in our practice, we've been tested a lot in a number of ways. Our beginnings was in healthcare, where we were questioned about the value architecture can bring to people dealing with global health issues, vaccines, people dying of hunger, people dying of like these diseases. And it pushed us really, really hard to try to prove that value that architecture can bring to support a cause of someone who's trying to end malaria or things like that. And then like slowly it evolved, and after 10 years, we are faced with people who challenge us in ways that is beyond simple scientific issues like healthcare. So the project you're talking about, if I can move on, the gun violence memorial came when we were at our National Memorial to Peace and Justice project we did in Montgomery, Alabama. And we did this lecture to a group of people who come to visit it. And this one woman approached us, and she told us about how her son was shot down. So he's a victim of this gun violence. And after visiting the memorial, she insisted that she's going to dedicate her life to figure out how to build a national memorial to victims of gun violence. But then she said something very interesting. She said that the thing that she hates the most is not that she lost her son, but that her son has been lost into statistics. Like we talk about these people in terms of statistics. And I think we're challenged to think about how do we reverse that effect and basically take all these people, all these stories that are lost into statistics, bring them back into life.
You know, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's like another example of the proximity, right? Because the statistics tend to distance us.
Exactly. It run into safe space where we talk about like generalization. So the whole project, basically, we started thinking about it from this way, and at the same time, you know, don't lose the sight of, because when she came to talk to us, there's already a lot of work that was being done by these people on the ground level to try to form groups where they meet, where they talk about what happened to them, where there is a process of healing for themselves. Like, you cannot discard that and say, because we are genius architects, we're going to come and, you know, give you something better that replaces all of these other things. So those were the two foundations that came about it. And so the whole kind of like thinking about it was to say, we're going to engage in a process of collecting objects. And what we have to offer as architects is actually not the memorial itself, but it's a platform that supports this memorial. And all these individual objects that people contribute are going to, so we were going to have basically like a house that is made of 700 glass bricks, and 700 represents roughly the victims of gun violence per month in the United States, as I understand the statistics. So it starts from that statistic, but then it walks backwards because it forces you to reckon with this object that comes from a person that has a story tied to it. And then the process of collecting that object is not simply to put it in mail and send it to us, but it's a process. We work with organizations like All Cities for Gun Safety and Purpose Over Pain, which is an organization that one of these moms had started, where you will come. Yes, give us the object, entrust that object to us, but then like you accompany it with a story that you have to record, and it's going to be part of that exhibition. And with that, I think like you start highlighting and say, one, we need to not ignore these statistics. They convey something to us. Like these houses are both complete and incomplete with these statistics. It shows the magnitude of that statistic. When you talk about it, like we don't reckon with it, like physically how big that is. It can build a house, you can enter into it. And then the other thing is like, you know, with filling it with these objects, then you start understanding that this is actually real people we're talking about who have individual stories that matters and make them human. Like you cannot dehumanize that statistic from that.
Right. Do you have other images, or is...
I think the other project I want to talk about, the other thing I wanted to mention is that the Gun Violence Memorial is now open at the Chicago Biennale at the Cultural Center in Chicago. So if any of you happens to be in Chicago in the next 3 months, please do visit. Let us know what you think.
Thank you.
And so this is the proposal we did for the Kigali Genocide Memorial, and I think it also comes from the same kind of like idea. So they wanted to do a national center for peace and justice, where people come to learn from these archives of all things that came from like the genocides and trials and things like that. And the whole concept was that it's built around these individual stories. So the things that look like the chimneys are like these like very deep units that go along the whole building. And at the bottom is like these recording studios where people can come and contribute their stories. And that becomes a repository over time where people can do that. And then like they change in sizes to demonstrate like these stories are unique in self, like none of them is the same. And you know, some of them are like where you can sit and like hear other people's stories and engage with it in a continuous manner. But then this becomes like this thing that will never die, because like that story is not something you record once. It's welcoming. You can, wherever you remember something else, you can come and do it. And in itself, it becomes like a healing process. Every time you pay a visit to this center, you can actually contribute something to it.
So this is, I mean, something that this aspect of these two memorials that you've talked about, and Sharon, even in yours, I know that you made it as clear, the participatory nature of it, which I think is really interesting and differentiates some of these contemporary memorials and movements from past ones where, you know, let's hold up the bronze statue again, which is sort of maybe some group of people decide that piece of art or that structure is going to go at a certain place and it's going to represent a certain person. But there's not much beyond that once it's there. And it strikes me that both in the pieces that you've talked about, this one and the Gun Violence Memorial Project, where you have the objects that people are contributing and the stories, it's almost like a collection of individual memory. I'm just thinking about the notion of how you get to the objects and the collective memory, right? And so Sharon, maybe you could say a little bit too about the participatory aspect of the work that happened over the course of those 2 weeks, in addition to the kind of dots, right? People could suggest names.
Yeah, there were two ways in which, I guess as I was interested in addressing absence, the things that I noticed, of course, is that there were many women who were working and contributing to all of these different spheres of life in Philadelphia, sort of through all of the centuries of its formation as a city, for sure. And also that my knowledge was not complete, that my knowledge was not wholly inclusive. And so at the onset of the project and in and through its preparatory phase, I had a group of sort of advisory, kind of an advisory group that I met with and that would contribute names and that filled the kind of landscape of names that far exceeded 78. I mean, 78 became what could fit sort of reasonably on the base. And then there is also an important component to the piece, which was a website where someone could go follow the name of the piece, which is If They Should Ask, and could see a list of names, bios about those people, images if they existed, and they could also submit more names, sort of to grow a collection. And I think that participatory aspect is important, but I think the work that you're doing, Christian, which is really expansive and ongoing, I think for If They Should Ask, it was also a provocation to the city, a provocation to people who had the interest, the time, and the money in the city to continue that work. So in this way, with that project, I let go of it. So the ... in some ways is also a space that I knew I could never fill, and that I hoped somebody might take up.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that there's an element of, even though, you know, Mass Design Group creates this thing, Sharon Hayes creates these. There is an element of giving over, right? Of both opening up both the creation, the construction of the piece, and also opening up the ownership of what it is that's getting remembered, right? All those stories and the dynamism of those stories become part of what's getting remembered, and you didn't decide all of that, right? So in both of those cases, that's interesting, and it also kind of combines the public and the private, which maybe, let's go back to that other image, which is of a, yeah, well, this is a site that maybe many of you pass if you cross the Walnut Street Bridge every day. And I guess Randy and I both discovered through the conversations about this panel that this was something that we both noticed and that Randy takes pictures of. So,
so we've all passed these. Maybe some of us have actually made them or fixed them or cleaned them up. Yesterday when I went past, somebody had stuck an empty coffee cup in the basket here that marks the site where a young man died in a traffic accident very nearby here. So I think the profundity of it, I think these are profound, and I think they reveal the very fraught process of figuring out how we express ourselves privately in terms of memory, remembrance, and forgetting in public space. These things, I'm not going in people's houses to try to find these. We all have that scale of memory ourselves, personally, in our houses, our families, our congregations, and so on. But when it goes out into public space, it means something different. And these are, I think, in lots of ways, and we worked with Ken and Paul and others on this. Like, these are validated as forms of memorials these days. These ephemeral memorials or informal, call them what you will. They show up on formal memorials, formal monuments, as kind of comments and almost a conversation pulling between public meanings and private meanings. I think it's important to acknowledge them and to also to let them deteriorate, because I think one part of the power of them to me is that we don't know who put them there. We don't know what's going to happen to them. We don't know when they're going to disappear, but we know they're going to disappear, just like memory and just like forgetting. So to me, there's something really touching about the fragility of them. And I only walk past and take pictures. I usually don't do anything to them. Try to conserve them, even though I work in the preservation department. I don't preserve it because I think sometimes it's more important to let it deteriorate, let it disappear.
yeah, and this one is interesting because sometimes it does get spruced up. One would, and I think we all bring our own stories and narratives to things like this, right? We imagine what happened. We imagine maybe there may be flowers there or letters that I've seen on particular days. So somebody is in an act of remembrance and maybe remembering an anniversary, but it's this kind of gray area between the public and the private, this particular memory that's very private, but that's being enacted in public space, right? And in the work that you've talked about, Christian, it's almost like a collection of those private memories, but that are brought into a space that everyone can experience and can't necessarily know all of the individual stories intimately, but collectively they make an impact, yeah?
Yes, and you're right. And at that time when you are engaging with that certain group of public, as to your earlier point about the multiplicity of publics, as a designer, as an architect, you're engaging with the narrow bandwidth of that spectrum. And Rendo is bringing up a very good point of what we were discussing earlier about the ritualization that comes with these creations we put out, that some of them we could never predict. For instance, I think his image illustrates that very well, where like there is somebody that we don't know has created like some sort of rituals that, in return has also allowed Rendo to create his own ritual of passing and photographing these things, and coming to this conference and talking to us about it, and giving these objects like even more value than it had when the original person put it there. So there is this dimension that we that is very difficult for us architects and designers to engage with. And for a certain long period of time, we've pretended that we know what we're doing in engaging it. And I think like by having like some sort of like flexibility in our own egos to say like we actually like, you know, the product of our work is going to be something that people can take up and use however they see fit, is something that we haven't been very good at. And I think that maybe the traditional notions of memorials and monuments have failed at addressing, or has maybe done in a way that we don't know now because we've never taken time to learn how that has evolved, or how it has come to be.
Thank you. So we have just maybe time for one more question. I want to kind of just circle back to the beginning, talking about how memorials, monuments, this whole conversation seems to have some renewed interest, or just there's a lot of conversation. Even this notion, I think, of traumatic heritage, I'm trying to think about how far back that goes. I know we do have memorials like that, but I just love to hear each of you speak about what you think that's about. Why is there this renewed interest? What's going on? What's the urgency? Are you getting more work on this? You know, what's in the air?
I'll start out with just two, I think, you know, obvious observations. One is that our society, speaking of American society for the moment, our society is so fractured and so contentious and so pitted against one another in so many different ways that we need more venues in which to work out these problems, and sometimes to express differences in a negative way, and sometimes to contest how we might actually live together in a more positive way. It's no surprise that you know, not just in the culture wars of the 70s and 80s and afterward, but the culture wars brought this to the surface in a way that's much more, you know, kind of serious, obvious, and abiding. So I think it's, you know, we should be contesting these basic political and social issues in memorials, in museums, in monuments, in design. We would be in bigger trouble if we weren't doing it, weren't using our work to pursue these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of what I said before about, I have really come to see the project of monumentalization in the US in particular as a political project rather than a historic project, in that there's no natural history that these objects are representing. What I think has changed is the political landscape, and I guess I would say it a little bit different, Randy, although I don't dispute what you're saying, which is that I think that there are cracks and fissures and openings that allow for a real interrogation of white patriarchy and of white supremacy. So if these objects, and not just the Confederate monuments, but the whole array of them, if they have been part of reproducing a white patriarch as the ideal citizen subject, that's changing. And it's a messy moment, and there are all sorts of messy responses, graffiti and spray paint and toppling. And I have to say, I am sort of buoyed, held up by all of them. I'm not saying that they're all pleasurable, but that they make me feel like there is an interrogation of the processes around which we built this public landscape. And that, for me, is the hope, that there can be a challenge to the process, the foundations that sort of got us where we are, and in that, openings for other ways of monumentalizing, other ways of memorializing, other ways of marking the significance of times and places and rituals and people.
Thank you.
Well, I would say for me, I think coming from Rwanda, it's evident. Like I think after a genocide as severe as the one that happened in our country, obviously we had no choice but to reckon with this. Because it has become an integral part of that country moving forward, and you know that will never go away. So we were really tested to we were tested to, as you say, to question what our role and our participation in engaging with that dialogue is and should be. But I think I don't think it's isolated to just monuments in the context we work from. I think there's this evolution of our society on the continent where every system of our lives is being tested to the limit, where we talk about the population more than doubling in the next 35 years, where we talk about efforts to end extreme poverty, where we talk about like the need to grow economies from being agriculture-based or extractive economies-based to more technological-based, because no one is even talking about industrialization. So I think all of these are things that are testing what our conventional thinking of doing things were. And I think in the architecture community is manifesting itself in really questioning how the shapers of the built environment either contribute in positively to these efforts, or we contribute to hurting these efforts.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking all the panelists again for your wisdom and insights. Turn it over to Fritz.
Lisa, Christian, Sharon, and Randy for such a fascinating, thoughtful discussion. Now I'd like to invite you to join us at Irvine Auditorium for today's keynote program, a conversation between Penn President Amy Gutmann and the renowned author and architectural critic Paul Goldberger. The conversation will begin at 3:30. It's a short walk over to 34th and Walnut. There are signs and people to guide you, so I hope to see you all at 3:30. Thank you.